My name is Frank Hodak, and today, July 14th, 2014, I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak not only with a respected law librarian and past president of the American Association, but with a very good friend. Carol Billings is the retired director of the Law Library of Louisiana, located in New Orleans. Our conversation is part of the Oral History of Law Librarianship project, a component of the Spinelli Law Library Reference Shelf on Hine Online. The setting for this conversation is the Hine Suite at the Marriott River Center Hotel in San Antonio, the site of the 2014 annual meeting of the American Association of Law Libraries. Carol, it is a great pleasure for me to speak with you today about your life and career as a law librarian.
Certainly a pleasure for me too, Frank. I'm honored to be included amongst this group of far more important people.
Oh no,
So
you are very high on our list of people to speak with, so we're very pleased to have you here with us today. Let's begin by learning a little about you personally. Can you tell us about your early life, where you were raised, your family background, what your childhood was like?
Well, I grew up in Cumberland, Maryland, which is that little skinny mountainous part of Maryland that most people don't know about, where if you looked out the window in one direction, you were looking at West Virginia, and if you drove 2 miles north, you were in Pennsylvania. In those days, Cumberland had about 40,000 people. It has shrunk to about 20,000. And so when I was a kid, I thought I lived in a big city. I later learned that it was very much a small town, but I think it was kind of an ideal growing up experience. I went to public school. I walked to school with other kids from the neighborhood. I took piano lessons, and in the summertime we had a program where we do recreational stuff at the local school playgrounds. I think I was very fortunate to have a very nice childhood. My mom was a very accomplished obstetrical nurse who worked all the time, but my widowed grandmother lived with us, and she was quite a wonderful woman, keeping house and just being fun for me as a kid to be around. And my dad was a sales representative for General Foods Maxwell House Coffee, so I say I have coffee in my blood.
Great. Did you have siblings?
I do not. I'm an only child. My mother was an only child. My daughter is an only child.
Well, let's ask a little bit, before we start talking about your professional life, let's learn a little bit about your personal life. What do you like to do when you're not working? What are some of your hobbies, passions, pursuits outside of law librarianship?
Well, I now call myself a professional grandma. I am known as Nana to my 2 grandchildren, Andrew, who is 9, and Charlotte, who will turn 3 in 2 days. And my daughter works at Tulane University, so each day during the school term and then in the summer when they're in camp, I pick them up after school or camp and take them home and stay with them till their parents get home. So I feel very privileged that I've gotten to know the children so well. I've become an expert at children's literature, children's television, but yeah, that's the most important thing that I do. I'm also very active in my church. My tiny little church is the Episcopal Chapel for the University of New Orleans and Southern University in New Orleans. And we prepare lunch for the students once a week. That's a big deal with the small number of us women who do it. And because our congregation is so little, we need to make money. So we rent out our social hall to private people for birthday parties and baby showers and wedding receptions. And I sort of run that operation.
Why am I not surprised?
It's kind of crazy, but I have met so many wonderful people doing that. I mean, they call me night and day about their arrangements.
I'm sure
but that's been a lot of fun. And I have become sort of involved in Episcopal Church activities on the diocesan statewide level, and that's been very interesting.
Well, that sounds like you have a very, very
well,
full life.
And I love to cook. and that's, you know, I enjoy doing that for the family and entertaining sometimes. And I should mention, I'm also in the League of Women Voters. You know, that's kind of an extension of my career,
Mhm.
being very interested in registering people to vote and even drafting some legislation to bring about some reform in New Orleans voting situations.
So you sound like the model retiree. You've got plenty on your plate.
And I have just retired as president of the Friends of the University of New Orleans Library, so that's
Excellent, thank you. Well, now we know something about your very busy personal life. We're going to talk about your very busy professional life in a moment, but in between, can you tell us about your educational and professional training and perhaps your early career aspirations?
right. Well, my great passion in high school was working for the school newspaper. And I think the most wonderful teacher I've ever had was my journalism teacher, Mary Calamine. And I think probably what she taught me about writing has been probably to the extent that I've had any talent in what I do. I think it was more in my writing and, you know, writing how to argue for causes that I cared about.
Ability
and
to
that sort of
communicate
thing.
and advocate.
Right. My school was a big public little town, but big public high school,
Mhm.
where I got to know all kinds of people and was I was not your cheerleader majorette type. I was your newspaper
Investigative reporter.
editor type, and got to go to New York a couple of times
Wow.
to the high school press convention, so that was great. Then went on to Gettysburg College, which is a small liberal arts college, obviously, in Gettysburg. And to this day, I'm very devoted to the college. I had a wonderful experience there, and I'm still a big supporter. Just went to my 50th reunion last summer. But there again, the newspaper was the big thing. I did become editor of the school newspaper and, you know, wrote editorials. And it was when Jack Kennedy was running for president.
Yeah.
It was sort of an exciting
I
time
bet it
to
was.
be
That's right.
to be doing those things.
Very good.
So, well, from there,
So were you thinking journalism as the
I
career
thought quite
path?
a bit about it, but you know, I regret the fact that I think in those days, a lot of us women had thought of it. I thought I'm going to be a high school English teacher, something bigger and more dramatic and kind of risky had not occurred that much to me. I knew I was going to have to do something where I could support myself with as far as further higher education. And until almost the end of my senior year, I didn't know what I was going to do next. I thought I would teach.
Mm-hmm.
But so no thought of libraries at that point.
So you worked, however, eventually as a library trainee at the University of Pittsburgh before attending library school, I believe.
Right. I think what led to that, in fact, the woman who lived in the room next door to me in the dorm did aspire to be a librarian and talked about it quite a bit. And a recruiter from the University of Pittsburgh Library School was coming to campus to interview her and anybody else who might be interested. So I decided to go along and find out what that was about. And when I was offered the possibility of the traineeship, that sounded like a very practical, sensible thing to do. So even though there wasn't a lot of passion involved, that's what I ended up doing.
So I'm wondering if did your work in the trainee position kind of solidify your thinking that this is a good career choice?
I think so. I had only been in library school for a few months before I met Warren, my future husband, so that kind of started things off in another direction. But it was interesting being a trainee. In those days, they would place you in different departments in the library for part of your experience, so you could kind of have a taste of
Sure.
different things.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in documents for a while, but primarily I was part-time in the School of Social Work, where I met a lot of really interesting students and faculty, and admired what they did a great deal. And the rest of the time, I was in a division of the reference department called the Human Relations Area Files, which was this great anthropology collection on thousands of slips of paper, all filed in filing. I mean, it was the ideal thing to be computerized in the future, but that was too early for that.
Right.
So, and it was in that very department, in the Human Relations Area Files, that I met my husband.
I'll be darned.
Who
Well,
something else.
it must have been fated to happen.
It was.
Thank goodness it wasn't 10 years later and computers had taken over. So your first positions after receiving your graduate library degree in 1965 were in academic libraries, in circulation and acquisitions at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, and then working with microforms at the University of New Orleans. So tell us a little bit about those first positions in the academic world, because we don't ordinarily associate you with the academic world.
Right. Well, none of those specific jobs were things that interested me or excited me very much. I just plain needed a good job in a library. At that point, Warren was in graduate school in the history department at Northern Illinois. So when I finished my degree, I wanted to be able to work there. It just made sense.
Sure.
And the openings happened to be in circulation, periodicals, things that were pretty humdrum.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I felt fortunate to have them and liked the people I worked with, but the actual functions that I performed were nothing that I aspired to continue in. Once we moved to New Orleans, where Warren had taken a position in the history department at the University of New Orleans, once again, I wanted to have a job, and the things that opened up at UNO were part-time in the cataloging department, part-time in microforms. Again, things that did not excite me.
Worked on your bucket list.
But I must say, in microforms, they had this huge collection that was very disorganized, and people didn't know how to use it. So I took it upon myself to write a guide to that collection, which was something I was sort of proud of at the time. And then my daughter, Liz, was on the way. So I decided to take off 4 years while she was very little and just wasn't working. I was a stay-at-home mom for 4 years. And in later years, I have looked back and said, oh man, if I had known what was going to happen to me, I could have been going to law school at that time. But of course, at the time, that's not what.
Right. I wonder, in reflecting back on those early positions, which you, as you say, weren't necessarily doing things that were what you thought you wanted to do, but given your later positions as administrator of a library needing to oversee various operations, it ultimately was probably
One thing
a good
that was very useful at Northern Illinois, they were preparing, they were in the very early stages of planning for a new library. And somehow I managed to get myself on the planning committee. And that was a very, very valuable experience, considering that years later I was going to be working on the plans for the new Supreme Court library. So that was...
Yeah, sometimes we don't know what we're learning now, how we're going to use that, but many times it's going to come in handy. So we'll skip forward a little bit. You take some years off, and then in 1979 you left the academic library world to take a position at the Law Library of Louisiana.
Actually, it was 76.
76, pardon me, excuse me. So was it, you've talked about how you got the Northern, went to Northern, went to New Orleans. Was it just simply by chance that you ended up in a law library, or was that part of a larger plan in some way, shape, or form?
Very much happenstance. Little Elizabeth at that point was 4 years old and was going to go to pre-kindergarten. So I was sort of interested in the possibility of going back. a woman whom I had worked with at the UNO library during those few years was also a history department wife. And she happened to live next door to the director of the Law Library of Louisiana. I did not know there was such an animal as a law library. I had never been in one, had never met anybody who had worked in such a place. And the woman who was the director called my friend when there was an opening and asked her if she was interested in interviewing for the job. My friend was not interested and called me and said, "Carol, there's an opening at the law library. Would you like to interview for it?" And I did. And I've always said it was great good luck going to work for a 60-year-old woman, meaning that the odds were that in about 5 years or so she would retire and there would be the possibility.
So, again, working through the chronology and segueing into what you just introduced us to, in 1981,
Right.
5 years after
She
arriving there,
retired.
she retired. And you were appointed as director, a position you held until your own retirement in
Right.
2007. So I think that probably some of the listeners of this oral history may not be fully familiar with the Law Library of Louisiana. So I wonder if you could describe its mission, structure, relationship with other institutions and the like.
Well, it is both the librarian for the library for the Supreme Court of Louisiana, but it's also the state law library. There is no other large library intended to serve the state and the public there. But it was very much the library for the practicing bar in New Orleans. And back in those days, even big wheels in law firms would come to the law library. That over the years that
Sort of disappeared.
but we had lots of solo practitioners who practically lived in the library. We got to know our regulars very, very well, which was certainly a nice kind of development. We got to know the justices and their law clerks quite well. But of course, the other important aspect, we were completely open to the general public. And we had every sort of person coming there. Sometimes we would have, the person just interested in legal history or something. But primarily, we had a lot of poor souls off the street who were coming, because we were right smack downtown. We were quite close to the big charity hospital where lots of people went for their services, quite close to City Hall, all that sort of thing. So we had regulars who came in, who sometimes some poor souls who had some mental problems, who considered the library a nice, safe place, but they were very inquisitive. There was one guy we had who constantly ran for office or who constantly had a grievance against the city. I mean, they were very interesting. But I think we were I certainly was, and I think the rest of the staff, we were very devoted to the idea of serving the public. I think the justices might have chosen to keep the public out, but we were even open in the evenings, and we were open on Saturdays and had to take turns staffing then. We were open till 9 o'clock at night. And in those days, there was no thought of security. We had no security guard at all outside the library. Anybody could walk in, they didn't have to show identification. As time passed, all of that changed, and it became more difficult to maintain the permission to keep the library open because the justices did not like dealing with the security problems.
Sure.
They were concerned about their own safety and put up all these barriers, which was something I kind of fought with them about over the years.
Well, it must have been a challenge to work in, or to have a library that had really three pretty distinct and different client
Very
bases. And that's, I'm trying to think about what
Well,
other
well,
libraries are ever comparable setting.
so many of the other libraries in the state court and county group have that sort of challenge as well.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that presents challenges in terms of access. It present challenges in terms of acquisitions, I would assume.
All those things, right.
So, doing the math, I hope I've got this right, but I believe that if we look at the previous positions you held in the various libraries, and then when you became director, you had worked in the trenches, if you will, for 16 years before becoming a library
Actually,
director.
I think it was only 12 because I took those 4
Okay.
years off
Thank
when I
you
was
for again correcting
stay-at-home
me.
mom.
I'm glad we're getting that straight. Apologize for that. But in any case, a substantial number of years.
Mhm.
So my question is, what was the transition like moving into library administration when you became director of the law library?
Well, by the time I did have the opportunity to come, I very much aspired to that position. I really wanted that position, and I knew that it was likely to become available at some point. The previous director had not had any specific education for law librarianship. I think back in those days, it was common for the judges to appoint someone that they had family connections with, or if they had friends in the bar who had a relative who wanted. And so my predecessor was a very fine person. I've always been grateful to her. But she was not someone who had a great deal of professional training or expertise. So I saw lots of opportunities for ways that we could perhaps change and improve things. So I was very interested in I didn't look upon it as a burden. It was something I really wanted.
So it was a transition that you had been anticipating, or at least hoping for, and you'd been thinking long before about the things you might do if you had that opportunity. Well, that makes sense. You gave us a better understanding of the Law Library of Louisiana as an institution. I wonder if you can help us understand a little bit about your role as director of the Law Library of Louisiana. What kinds of issues did you address during your long tenure there? I hesitate to ask you what was a typical day, because I'm sure there probably wasn't a typical day, but what were the kinds of things that you would be doing as director?
Well, our staff was quite small. There were, I think by the time I retired, there were 9 or 10 of us, but in those early years there were only about half a dozen, and a few of the people were non-professional, sort of clerk type.
Right.
So we were all sort of prepared to do anything. I mean, my office sat where I could look at the main public service reference desk, and if we saw someone come up there and they were not being served because the reference librarian was, I would jump up and so I really enjoyed doing legal research, which I had kind of learned on the job, but I thought over time I became better and better at it. Enjoyed doing that a lot. So it was nice having the regular contact with the public and with the attorneys who came in. A great deal of my time was spent on financial matters, worrying about the budget. Always, I think I spent about 3/4 of the year preparing the budget for the next year and writing all the arguments. Over time I collected a lot of statistics. And one time I conducted a survey of all of the other state law libraries and what their budgets were like and their circumstances were like, and then wrote a very lengthy report to the judges telling them why we needed more money for the collection and why our staff needed to be compensated better. So there was a great deal of financial stuff. Also, very early in my tenure there, about 1981, the Supreme Court started worrying about having a bigger, better building than the one they were in. They had built that building only in 1958, so it was not terribly old. But of course, with all the technological revolution coming along, they were very anxious to have something much more up to date, larger, to accommodate the the growing staff that they were having of judicial administrator
So we're
types.
talking not just about a building for the library, but a building for the
For
court.
the entire court,
Right.
yes. And they, obviously, they were far more concerned about the facilities for the judges and all of the operations relating to them, more than they were about the library. But it meant we were going to have to argue as strenuously as we could to get best possible accommodations for the library. So they started thinking about this back in the early 1980s. And had to decide, were they going to campaign for a thoroughly new building? Were they going to expand the one they were in? I mean, for a long time they were all. And then they discovered that they were well aware that in the middle of the French Quarter sat a huge Baroque, elaborate building that had been built at the very beginning of the 20th century as the Louisiana Supreme Court. After they had been in that building for, as I say, the current building we were in was built in 1958. So after they had been in that French Quarter building for only 50 years, they decided they needed a new modern building, which they got. Then, of course, they needed something far better and far grander. And they started looking at that old building again, which by this time had been abandoned. It had been a wildlife and fisheries museum and other state stuff. And then they thought, maybe we could go back and thoroughly redo, renovate, refigure that building to make a very grand new Supreme Court. And in 1981, the experts told them, oh, for about $15 million, you can do this. 20 years later, when it was accomplished, they had spent only $75 million. And it took 20 years of trying to get the funding from the state, employing various architects and experts and all kinds of stuff about how to accomplish this in this building. And all this time, we in the library knew we were going to be a very big part of this, and we were going to have to figure out how much space we would need, because in those days we were very concerned about having much larger collections growing and growing. So I was trying to collect all these statistics and do all these mathematical things to figure out how much more space I needed. So a huge amount of my time, over 20 years, was planning for this building and doing various sets of plans and arguments and programs and all this stuff. So,
and I imagine that your forecasts of what you would need changed considerably over that 20-year period.
Absolutely. It became sort of embarrassing as time passed, because you realized that, and it was very hard to, with any state situation, once you have asked for something, it's very hard to make changes, because there are all these facilities planning people who kind of get things written in stone and then they don't want to change it. So, yeah, that was quite an adventure over time. But we eventually ended up with a very beautiful library. And
one to be proud of.
And now
it functions well for.
And now the current director, Georgia, and her staff have had to make so many changes and get rid of a large part of the collection because it's no longer used. So, yeah, that's an adventure.
Well, in addition to taking on those kinds of big issues, I imagine, again, having that varied clientele that you described earlier led to some, quote, interesting experiences, probably enough to fill a book. Are there a few stories about life at the Law Library of Louisiana that you might wish to share with us?
Yes, well, even when we were still in the 1958 building, which we were for the largest part of my tenure, somehow we became quite the gathering place for people throughout the building, all these judicial administrator types and law clerks and everybody. And we would always have the big Christmas party each year in the library. We loved planning that and doing the food. And one of the justices, Fred Blanche, who who was your typical Louisiana good old boy, a wonderful man, had his own jazz band, and Judge Blanche was a big supporter of the library. So when we came up with the idea of having a Friends of the Library organization, we needed to do something to kick it off and make people aware of it. And he said, I will give you the money to have a big party to kick off the beginning of the library. And we had Judge Blanche had his band there. I remember when the doors opened, and there he was singing "Ain't Misbehavin'." So I will never forget that lovely experience. And then we would have the Christmas party every year. We would dance. There was a wonderful guy on our staff named Bill Luster, an African American guy who had always worked in the library and had been considered, so he was called the porter by earlier generations of people. And he and I became good friends, and I said, Bill, I'm emancipating you. You're going to be called a library assistant. And Bill and I would always dance at the Christmas party, and I have very fond memories of that. As far as interesting patrons we had, I mentioned we had these folks who would come in off the street. We had one famous regular, the Reverend Walter Cook. He was a self-proclaimed minister, and then he elevated himself to bishop. And he's the one, I would say, he ran for mayor. He sued the bus company, the utility company, and he was there every day doing his. He was a totally unlettered person, but he came and did his legal research all the time and almost became a member of ours. And he would constantly come in my office to talk with me about everything. But another guy I'll never forget, and he was kind of intimidating because he was about 7 feet tall. Again, an African-American man who carried a big staff. And he considered himself a member of the Rockefeller family, and for some reason he liked me, and he had decided that he was going to establish a new world government, and he would be the head of it. But because he admired women, the members of his cabinet were going to be all women, and he told me he was going to be Queen Elizabeth, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, and me. And he said, Miss Carroll, when we're all ready to set it up, it's going to be in India. He said, I will come and get you. And the staff used to worry when he would come in that he had come to get me to take me away. But yeah, having folks like that always made life always interesting.
I'll bet. That's fantastic. Well, hearing about those individuals, that's a good segue to switch gears a little bit by talking about some of the individuals that you've met and worked with during your career. We haven't talked about mentors yet, but I would be interested if you identify one or more people as a mentor, and then just others in the profession or with whom you worked that you especially admire.
Well, the first person I have to mention, my dear, dear friend Betty Kern, who came to work at the library. She was another University of New Orleans faculty wife whom I knew slightly. And when we had an opening for an acquisitions person that didn't necessarily have to be a professional librarian, Betty applied, and we ended up working together for well over 20 years and became such dear, dear friends and came to AALL and SEAL together. So yeah, and Betty retired some years back and now has some serious health issues, which is very sad.
Sorry
but
to
I
hear that, but
had to mention
favorite
her
person of many people, absolutely.
But as far as other mentors, years ago when Law Library Journal was doing an issue about who was your mentor, I named Ed Bellefontaine from the Social Law Library in Boston as my mentor, because we never got to spend a lot of time together because we lived too far apart. But through the state court and county special interest section, I had gotten to know Ed. He was really a leader in that group,
Absolutely.
as was Maria Sekula, who worked with him. And I admired so much what Ed had accomplished at the Social Law Library. Wonderful public relations kinds of things. He had established a very supportive board. They did wonderful history projects and programs and all that sort of thing. And I admired all of that so much that once when, I guess it was when AALL was in New Orleans in 1991, Ed came to town and I brought him to the court to meet our Judge James Dennis, who was our sort of library advisor, so that Ed could tell him all about what he was doing, because it was what we aspired to do. So I admired that a great deal. Other folks in that state court and county group, of course, Fred Baum from the New York Bar Library, Bethany Ogle from California, all the folks in that group, and Marcia Kozloff, who was the Wisconsin State Law Librarian, was doing some very innovative, aggressive things and was a real leader in the group. And one time a bunch of us went to one of the big court conventions. It must have been the first conference on court technology, both to learn and to sort of get our message across to these judges that court libraries really mattered, and this was what we wanted to do as far as new technology and stuff. So there was all that bunch. Then, aside from the court librarians, I think back in the early 80s at some point, I must have gone to one of my first SEAL meetings, SEAL chapter meetings.
Southeastern chapter.
I had never heard of a woman named Lolly Gasaway, and she was a speaker at that particular meeting. I was absolutely enthralled. I thought she was so wonderful. She was talking, in this particular program, she talked about the importance of equal pay for equal work for women, which is something that I, over the years, Lolly championed a great deal. So I immediately thought she was just terrific, and I was thrilled that over the years we became dear friends. She even came to my daughter's wedding, and when my daughter was applying to colleges and we went to North Carolina, we stayed with Lolly. So that was the beginning of a great friendship. Kathy Price was another person who early on I had seen her present at meetings, and then when she was president of the association, I'm trying to think what year that was, around 80,
early 80s,
3, 4,
yeah,
something like that.
there.
I again thought she was just such a wonderful role model, and we too became good friends. As far as others whom I admire a great deal and have become good friends, Dick Danner, I remember meeting him there was, in the days when we used to have institutes before the annual meeting. There was one held in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia, and I think Warren and I pulled into the parking lot, and this individual whom I had never seen before, who was lost, just as we were trying to find him, there was Dick Danner. And over time, we became good friends, and I admire him tremendously. I'm looking forward to going to his lecture that he's going to present right after
Distinguished lecturer
right
for
after
2014, absolutely.
this. So Bob Baring, Sally Wyant, people whose minds and intellectual accomplishments I admire so much are particular role models for me. I mentioned Marcia Kozloff because I admired so much what she was doing in what became citation reform. Lynn Foster, who fought that battle. Some of us spent a lot of time together and communicated with each other a great deal over those issues.
Absolutely. Well, you've mentioned some very important people in the profession, but also people who I know you consider personal friends as well.
Yeah.
That's great.
Now, if I may mention personal friends
please
as
do.
well as Well, probably my dearest friend of all in the profession is Jim Heller. Our two families have become so interconnected. Jim lives in Williamsburg, Virginia, of course, and Warren and I are there a good deal. And we've become dear friends of Jim and his wife Janet and their sons. One of their sons lived with us briefly in New Orleans after he graduated. And then the others who fall in that same category as dear, dear personal friends are Hazel Johnson and Tim Coggins. They're in Virginia. They're people, we're all so close that when we've had major events in our lives, they also came to my daughter's wedding and helped bring all of that off. We've had occasions in Virginia where Warren and I were doing some history-related entertaining, and Hazel and Tim and Jim all came and helped with that. So they're very dear to me.
So one of the great things about the profession, I think, is the ability to combine the professional work and the personal work, and to have people that maybe start out as professional colleagues become dear personal friends.
Right. I consider the greatest gift that being in the profession has given me is my dear personal friends.
Well, we don't usually ask the subject of these oral histories to comment on their spouses, but you've already mentioned your husband, Warren Billings, a distinguished history professor by profession, but he has been a regular attendee and active participant at the meetings of ALL, in fact, a frequent speaker at ALL meetings and other library groups for many years. I wonder if you'd like to tell us a little bit about Warren's support for you and the law library profession down through the years.
I think it was wonderful for both of us that when we met that we both loved a lot of the same things as far as our intellectual life, history and books and all that stuff. And when way back, shortly after we were married, when Warren was doing research for his dissertation and fortunately had to go to England to be able to, I would help him with his research. It was something I enjoyed very much because I was a history minor in college and had just always been interested in that kind of thing. And he loved books and he used our library a great deal over time and became a great supporter of it. And of course we've had such good travels together, which we'll probably be talking a bit about as far as getting to know our friends in England in Bile. But we have often said it's been a wonderful combination that we both care and enjoy so much about the same kinds of things in both of our professions.
Well, that's great, and I know a lot of people, they certainly look forward to seeing you at conferences and meetings, but
There was one year I couldn't come, he came anyway.
Very good. Well, Carol, you've served the law library profession in so many ways, too many really to mention, but I do want to single out your work on the national scene as chair of the state court and county law libraries and the social responsibility special interest sections, as well as your service as president of 2 chapters, the New Orleans and Southeastern chapters. You then served 3 years on the AAL executive board before becoming president. Can you describe what being so professionally active has meant to you?
Well, as I mentioned before, having made so many wonderful friends is the number one thing. But I think I also had an opportunity to become involved in causes that I cared a great deal about. Of course, with the state court and county group, the fact that we were always fighting to bring better service to the public and sort of the downtrodden, that was important to me. The SEAL chapter has always been dear to my heart. Again, so many wonderful friends, but I think we're a chapter that we had great leaders, people like Lolly Gassaway and Dick Danner and some of the great stars, Jim Heller, great stars of the profession in that chapter. So we were always very proud of the high quality of the programs. Our conferences were on a level of the national one. We had lots of people, but the quality of what you learned about was wonderful there. But we also had so much, I think the most fun I ever had in the profession was all the way back, it must have been 1988, or whenever we went to Reno, 88, 89, something like that, is when the West Talent Show.
Oh, yes.
And we decided that, I think it was Nancy Strohmeyer and I decided that we had to have an entry in the talent show. And we did Showdown at the Long Branch Law Library. And we were all cowboys and chorus girls. And, you know, we went to Reno carrying all of our costumes. We had to make a portable bar out of cardboard, pack it up, and ship it to Reno to be. And we won first prize.
Yes, you did.
One of the great moments of my professional life. It's terrible to admit that some of those things were great, but it brought
really
about
humanizes
great
the
camaraderie.
profession. Absolutely.
One thing that was great about that, those of us who were in courts, law firms, academic library, you know, people that we admired a great deal were not afraid to act silly and have a great. Bill Bynum and I were talking about this, that he said I could talk him into doing anything crazy, and that's the way we felt about the whole works.
Great. Well, I can assure you, because I was in the audience, that the audience loved it just as much as you did putting it on. You served as ALL president in 1994-95, adopting Connected for Justice as the theme of your year and the annual meeting in 1995 in Pittsburgh, over which you presided. I was about to join the executive board as president-elect at that point, so I had the privilege of having a first-row seat in Pittsburgh when you and Jim Heller, who you've mentioned several times, introduced something brand new for ALL, the National Conference on Legal Information Issues. Can you talk about this initiative a bit and what you believe it achieved for the law library profession?
I was very keen on making that happen because, you know, we were always our profession was always very concerned with letting the rest of the larger legal profession know how valuable law libraries and law librarians were. So I thought if we could only bring people from the practicing bar and the courts and the entire larger profession to our meeting to see how smart and clever and accomplished our members were, I thought that's going to be the strongest way we can broadcast our value to them if they get to know us personally. And if we ask them to be on programs with us where we're interacting, I thought it would also raise the quality of our programs if we could have people, you know, big time partners and deans and law faculty and judges, all those folks coming and participating in our conference. I sort of had to fight to make this happen because other members of the AALL board at the time were very reluctant to change the structure of our meeting. And in order to make this happen, we had to lengthen the meeting to some extent to make it start earlier, to have programs going on right in the beginning. And there was the possibility of getting a substantial grant from I'm trying to remember the name of the court, I should have looked this up, the court-related, a federal court-related program that was going to make it possible for us to request money to bring judges or court administrators to our meeting. So I got a $15,000 grant to pay for the expenses of bringing a couple of dozen people. And then, of course, we had to find the ideal people who would be willing to take time off from their jobs to come and to participate in the programs as well. So it took the year leading up to it probably took far too much of my time away from work making it happen. But I was very devoted to the idea of, and to this day I still think it was a big success. One of the proud moments was when it was starting and all these people were coming in, and Bob Oakley said to me, "This is the way I always hoped we could be." And I'll never forget that, because I admired Bob. I should have mentioned Bob's name earlier, but I admired him so tremendously, and he was a major participant in what went on. And I think we discussed a lot of big controversial issues at that meeting.
Well, it was a good model for some things that came afterwards.
Yeah, Jim did it again.
And
Claire
you had VIP
Germain
programs
did
and
things
all
like
sorts
that.
of things that really kind of, in my mind, was one of the first, if not the first, thing where we actually, instead of just talking about it, we actually tried to do something about reaching out and not just saying it's important to get our message out to others, but to actually do something.
Yeah, I think
about
that's probably the thing I'm proudest of that I helped to make happen.
Well, that's definitely something worthy of being proud about, but you also played a crucial role in creating the Biennial Joint Study Institute, first held in September 1998 at the University of Cambridge in England, and now co-sponsored by the British, American, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand Law Library Associations. I know you mentioned it earlier, but let's talk directly about you and Warren have been staunch supporters of our law library colleagues overseas, so much so that you were elected an honorary life member of the British and Irish Association of Law Librarians, BIAL, in 2003. Tell us what that joint institute and recognition from BIAL and sort of related things means to you.
Well, you know, in 1995, when we had the National Conference on Legal Information Issues, fortunately, it was a year when a number of folks from abroad were able to come and attend that meeting. We really wanted them to be there and participate. And there must have been at least 4 or 5, maybe more, members of BIAL, and I think people from the Australian Association, Canadian Association were going to be present. So I got us all together in one or more meetings where we discussed the possibility of having a joint conference. In the beginning, it was just the Canadians, the Brits, and the Americans. The Australians and New Zealanders got in the act considerably later. But we had serious planning. That's when I got to know Jules Winterton well, Barbara Turrell. There were a number of others from England who were very involved in that. So that started my friendship with some of those folks. And of course I felt so fortunate to get to go to BIAL. The first of all places, the first one I got to go to was in Belfast, a place I never thought I would visit. And then there was one other, I think it might have been you, who was unable to attend the year you would have gone. And I was going to go anyway, and I think kind of got to represent the association in a sense. But Warren and I had such a wonderful time getting to know our English colleagues, attending there. We learned so much at the meetings. But they really know how to have a good time. They always have dancing and some sort of fun aspect where everybody's going together to do some sort of fun event. I mean, I've kissed the Blarney Stone. all kinds of crazy stuff. I've gone on the Beatles tour in Liverpool. But basically, Warren and I enjoyed it so much that we decided we would continue going back on our own as often as we could. And I counted up the other day because I realized we had gone to a lot of places in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, etc., that we would have probably never gone to had we not been going to attend the BIAL meeting. I think we went to 11 or 12 different BIAL meetings and made dear friends who, well, one of those dear friends who was known to our members as Lynn Quiney, because that was her name at the time, is now Lynn Holman, and she and her husband became such dear friends of ours. We have visited them many times over there and stayed with them, and they've stayed with us on this side as well. So those folks are dear to me. And one thing I wanted to make sure of afterwards is that we would welcome folks from abroad as vigorously as they welcomed us when we went over. So I tried to get some initiative going. We had a special committee to sort of establish some guidelines for ways we could welcome and entertain the visitors so they would have an opportunity to get to know people and feel welcome rather than just sort of being alone in the great sea of thousands.
Well, I think that effort's been a tremendous one, and one that continues today. So that's absolutely a legacy that you've given to us. I want to ask you about one more important contribution. It's one that's dear to my own heart. As president-elect in 1994, you appointed me to chair a special committee on the history of law librarianship. The committee accomplished a few things, and committee work is like that. You have a long list, and if you've accomplished a few things, you're happy with it. One of them was producing a fine book edited by Lolly Gassaway. You've already mentioned her, and Mike Chirazi. But I believe, personally, its real importance was in preparing the way for what became ALL's centennial celebration, culminating in 2006. You oversaw that process by serving as chair of the special committee on the ALL centennial celebration from 2002 to 2006. You've already mentioned your interest in history. I just like to ask you to comment about why this history of law librarianship in particular is so important to you.
Well, I think it's very important for us to document the contributions of the people in our profession, the libraries that they operate, and what they as individuals have done as far as making policy and advances in technology, everything that enables us to give better service to people. I think we need to let people, to record that and let people know. Speaking of history, I should have mentioned it in connection with the Law Library of Louisiana. During the time I was there, we started to place much more emphasis on history because we thought it really enhanced the mission of our library a great deal, to be a place where people could come and learn about the legal history of Louisiana and the larger nation. And while I was there, we started a museum of legal history, and Georgia Chadwick and her staff have followed and done wonderful exhibits there. So I think the whole subject of legal history, whether on the individual library basis or for our association, really matters. That's why I feel sad when people say, "Oh, we don't need any books, we don't need any physical stuff anymore. Everything can just be electronic." And I think one thing that enables people to understand why law libraries matter, why law librarians matter, is to show them the history. Mm-hmm. And you have, I have to say, have been the primary person who has made this happen. I mean, it's spent a huge amount of work on the history of AALL in our profession, well, so I appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate those kind
deal.
Words, but and again, you were a big inspiration.
And we certainly had fun doing that centennial.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that was another thing that we sort of had to fight to make happen, because some people thought it was so frivolous, but we wanted to make our members aware of the history. So starting, I think, 2 years before the centennial, we dressed up as people.
Up?
Frank was A.J. Small, our leader. But and I remember carrying all that stuff to the meetings. We had the big hats and the long dresses and all that stuff. But it was great.
It was fun, yeah. But I think it also conveyed the larger point, which is that it is important to know where you've come from, and it helps you understand what it is, what's really important and what isn't. Well, in addition to the recognition from BIAL, which I've already mentioned, your peers have honored you with the Southeastern Chapter's Distinguished Service Award, State Court and County Law Libraries SIS Bethany Okle Award for Distinguished Service to the Profession, the ALL Hall of Fame Award, and ALL's highest honor, the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award. What does such recognition from your colleagues mean to you?
Well, of course, the fact that I appreciate and honor all these colleagues so much, the fact that they would think well enough of me to confer these honors upon me means a great deal to me. And I guess the other reason I'm particularly pleased to have some of these, I think we all try to set an example for those coming after us, the young people who come into the profession. We want to get them excited about our profession and what it can mean to them. So we want them to aspire to be leaders as well, and to realize how much they can learn and benefit from being part of it. And any honors that any of us receive, we hope the younger guys will see these things and say, I want to do that too. That's worth doing.
Very good. Very well said. Carol, we've covered a wide range of topics already, but before we end our conversation, I do want to give you the opportunity to touch on any topics that we might have missed. So is there anything you'd like to add before we
I guess I have to say something about, because it took a lot of time and effort back at the time it was going on, and that was the whole movement for citation reform, bringing about the vendor-neutral citation. I mentioned way back my friends Marcia Kozloff, Lynn Foster, Bob Oakley, Jim Heller too was involved. Those of us who felt very strongly that it is the American public who own the law, not individual publishers of legal information. And some of us felt so strongly that we had to facilitate the process of bringing the law to people at lower cost, and making, in my case, making the information generated by the court immediately available to people at as low a cost as possible, rather than having a publisher intervene between us and insist that citations had to be to their materials. So I guess I got the bee in my bonnet from Marcia in Wisconsin and other friends talking about this issue. So back in, what is the year? I started working on trying to persuade the Louisiana Supreme Court to adopt a vendor-neutral citation that would not rely upon the page numbers in a publication. And we had been approached by a small publisher, by an Arkansas attorney who was producing a CD product with the Louisiana cases. He had already done it for Arkansas, wanted to do it for Louisiana and other states, and was going around promoting this idea. And I very much bought into that idea, and was, over a period of many months, was able to persuade our court that this was something worth trying, that it was going to save them a lot of money, for one thing, because they could buy this product and make it available to all of the judiciary. So I got very involved in that whole movement, wrote about it quite a bit, or got into trouble quite a bit. But it was something that mattered to me. And then as time went on, there were further, there have been a number of iterations of committees dealing with citation format reform, all that kind of
And produced a citation guide.
Exactly.
That
So
would
that
facilitate the use
that
of
was something
kind of
that
citation.
mattered a great deal to me.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. It's an example, it seems to me, of the kind of thing. I mean, this was a movement that essentially was led by law librarians.
Absolutely.
But again, going back to the values and the goals that you talked about for the law library profession generally, and then put into practice in this specific instance, it's really something to remember and to use as perhaps a model for other
Right.
areas and other issues. Well, very good. Thank you for reminding us about that. Carol, on behalf of Pat Keogh, Michelle Wu, and Dick Spinelli, my colleagues with the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, I want to thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today about your experiences as a law librarian. Your remarks will be a valuable addition to our project and of interest to both current colleagues and to those who will join the profession in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much too.